I see quorum, and we've done all our sound checks, and in this particular instance, the weather check, which is part of the sound check, is extremely relevant as Mr. Fillmore is in Halifax digging out as we speak. So we'll probably see him around May. So.
After the melt.
Yeah, yes, exactly. We are continuing on our study on housing, and we are fortunate to have Mr. Lick with us, who is the ombudsman for the military, and we appreciate his regular appearances here. So I take note, sir, that not only are you appearing today, but it may be that you're going to appear on one of our other studies on the 12th as well. So I hope you don't shoot everything you've got today and have nothing left to say. And I understand you have made heroic sacrifices to be here. I'm hoping that members will take note that he is under the weather and not grill him to a piece. So, anyways, Mr. Lick, you know the procedure. We look forward to what you have to say for the first 5 minutes.
Well, in comparison to my military members, it is not a heroic sacrifice by any means. Good morning, committee members. I am joined by my Director General of Operations, Ms. Robin Hines. During my time as Ombudsman, I've completed 15 full-week visits to bases and wings, listening to members and families. Access to health care, child care, spousal employment, and more recently, the cost of living and housing are recurring themes during these visits. I've heard from a member's dependent who shared with me that they had been homeless for 5 months. I hear from families using food banks. I've also heard from some who are one paycheck away from not paying the rent or needing to make a hard decision between food and rent. Cette situation n'est pas exclusive aux familles militaires.
This situation is not exclusive to military families, but military families are 3 to 4 times more likely to move than the average Canadian families. Generally, this is not by choice. Families have a limited window to complete the move and resettle. This means they must quickly find housing in a new community they may be unfamiliar with.
Sometimes pushed into either unsafe or unaffordable housing. While members do not expect a lot from their barracks, I was shocked to see some of the deteriorating single quarters on base that are not acceptable for any human in any situation. This was not my experience in the 80s. A formal wellness check by CAF leadership is the right thing to do, but may not uncover every situation. This committee must uncover what is behind the disparity. Are military families living in tent cities? Perhaps not. Are there military members and their families who are at significant risk of being homeless due to financial insecurity? Yes. Are there charitable organizations across the country helping keep some of these members and families off the streets? Yes. When CAF members cannot secure military housing, there is a significant impact on their lives as they must then live on the economy. This is not ideal when there is a lack of local, suitable, and affordable accommodations in many areas in Canada. Military families may not be protected from rate height limitations for existing tenants. At greatest risk are lower-ranked members and families with special needs or disabilities when they cannot secure affordable accommodations. En janvier 2024,
in January 2024, the Canadian Forces Housing Agency provided their annual updated statistics to our office on our HU waitlists. 2022 and 2023 demonstrated a continued increase. Today, there is a 177% increase in Bagotville and 261% increase in Edmonton.
In Esquimalt, Halifax, and Trenton, there are almost as many members and their families on the wait list than there are total units. Another example, some posted military families in Alberta lost up to $100,000 due to housing market fluctuations related to oil patch financial ups and downs. This is unconscionable. It would be unrealistic to see the government provide military housing for every member and family. Families should be able to choose their housing throughout their career, whether on base or in the local community. Une stratégie globale qui est agile.
An overall accommodation strategy that is agile could help members adapt to the changing economic environments around the country.
Be explored and properly resourced. The reality of military life often means that temporary spousal unemployment becomes permanent. Often a spouse must take a break from paid work to settle their family in a new community. This unemployment and/or potential underemployment exacerbates the financial uncertainties for families and their ability to afford suitable housing. Je remarque une grande différence chez les familles militaires.
Within the past year, I've noticed a real change in military family communities. There's more frustration, there's more desperation. And these family issues are the #1 reason military members are leaving the Canadian Armed Forces.
Nor their family should ever have to worry about putting a roof over their heads or to wonder where their next meal is going to come from. This is a basic need that should not become their daily reality and impede CAF members' ability to keep Canadians safe. Thank you. Robin and I would be pleased to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lick. Mr. Bazan, 6 minutes.
Before you start my time, Mr. Chair, I would like to just give verbal notice of two motions.
The time is running, Mr. Bazan.
Given that the Minister of National Defence is increasing rent for Canadian military personnel this April, and at a time when the military is struggling to recruit and retain personnel, the committee report to the House that the government immediately cancel all plans to increase rent on military accommodations used by the Department of National Defence this April. The second motion I wish to give notice of, that given the Ukrainian armed forces are in desperate need of more munitions, and the armed forces of Ukraine have officially requested Canada donate surplus CRV-7 rockets to Ukraine to aid them in defending their sovereign territory from Russia's illegal invasion, and that given the Canadian Armed Forces are in possession of 83,000 CRV-7 rockets that are slated for decommissioning and will cost taxpayers money to dispose of, therefore the committee report to the House that the Government of Canada immediately donate all surplus CRV-7 rockets to the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
So 5 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Ombudsman for joining us today and for his insight on the housing crisis that we have. Appreciate the statistics that you've given. You mentioned that there is more frustration and more desperation now in your opening statements. Is that from written comments you're receiving? Is this coming from members when you're traveling across the country and meeting with them?
Yeah, primarily it's coming from the meetings with different members and families as we visit different bases and wings across the country. So I'm hearing a lot more, and even when I bring up the issue of, do you know someone who is, at risk of being homeless or at risk of accessing a food bank? Everybody nods. Everybody knows somebody, and we know that charitable organizations are providing money to families sometimes through the chaplaincy to be able for them to afford rent and afford food. So I'm hearing it a lot more over the last year and a half.
So if you're hearing about people living rough, that they're putting themselves into precarious situations to access housing, couch surfing, going to food banks, we saw the reports come out of Nova Scotia in December. That was from the hearings held at the legislature of Nova Scotia, a special committee hearing that they had. The Canadian Armed Forces said that they did a wellness check and that those comments were categorically false. The minister repeated that in question period on Thursday. But you're hearing that members are in dire straits and are frustrated and desperate. So you would disagree with the CAF report that everybody's fine?
Certainly, as I said, a wellness check is the right thing to do. It's something that I would have done if I was in that position as well. But you have to think that if you were homeless, would you have the confidence and the comfort level to come forward and with an embarrassing situation and tell your boss that you're homeless or that you can't afford, you have to access a food bank? I think they trust us because we are a confidential service, but I think. While it's the right thing to do, they're not going to find every situation. And I think they have to recognize that it's not just me saying it. Charitable organizations are providing money. Chaplaincy is accessing these funds for different members and families. It's there.
So you're saying that Canadian Armed Forces should not have just offhandedly dismissed the allegations or the comments that were made through testimony at a committee in front of the Nova Scotia legislature?
I think they did the right thing, but they have to recognize that they're not going to get all the information just by asking people.
So the characterization by the minister saying that the reports are false would be misleading at best.
I think so. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Now you are talking about the wait lists and how many people are waiting for residential housing units. You have experience as well when in barracks. When you're a younger man. How do you visualize the status and condition of living accommodations in residential housing units, whether it's barracks or PMQs or elsewhere, compared to when you were there 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, so certainly the RHUs, the residential housing units on base, they are getting some updates, but more capacity, more availability is needed. That's kind of the basic premise. But I also saw in a number of pictures of the barracks that were sent to us by military members, what I saw was absolutely horrid. This was not my experience in the, yes, we weren't living in five-star accommodations 30 years ago, and nor would we expect to. But at the same time, these pictures that I saw were absolutely horrid. And we do hear from a number of military members, single members traditionally, that the barracks and shacks, as they call them across the country, are not in the best condition. Definitely, absolutely, more resourcing and more investment is needed there to bring them up to proper living standards.
There have been comments.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Oh, done? Oh.
Thank you. Mr. Collins, you have 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our guests today. Sir, you mentioned in your opening, you talked about members living paycheck to paycheck, and you've talked about the affordability issues that they face. For most levels of government, when we start looking at the challenges of affordability, many in the municipal and provincial levels have talked about a universal basic income, and so they start to address not the expense side of the equation, but the supports and the revenue side in terms of the ability of an individual to pay for rising rents in this instance. When we deal with CAF, I mean, that would point to compensation. That would deal with how much the government's providing its members and to provide them the ability to pay for rising rents and the affordability issues they face when they go to the grocery store, as all other Canadians are facing. In December, we had a vote. It wasn't unanimous in the House of Commons to increase the pay for our members to try to assist with the affordability issues that you've raised today. Again, it wasn't unanimous. But how important is it to ensure that our members receive the appropriate level of compensation to ensure that they have the ability to pay for rising rents, the increased costs that they'll face when they go to the grocery store with their families, and other expenditures that we're witnessing today in our Canadian economy?
Well, I mean, certainly the simple answer is yes, they deserve the proper compensation so that they can live appropriately. I think there are a number of initiatives that the CAF and the government itself has put in place to allow members to better afford. So certainly they corrected the huge inequity and unfairness that PLD, so post-living differential, was before, where great idea at the time in 2008, but if you don't update the rates based on the economic environment across the country as it changes, 2009 it became unfair. And it was completely unfair all the way along. At least with the Canadian Forces Housing Directive now, it is focused and it's supposed to be updated every year. That will go a long way, I think, to helping out this particular issue. But we come back to, it is two things, supply and demand. And right now there is insufficient supply out there, both on base and in the local community. And compensation does allow for the different benefit packages that do mitigate some of these issues. But right now, without the supply there, the costs are rising far beyond likely what the compensation can afford. And we're seeing that when members access food banks and are one paycheck away from paying the rent.
And I'll take my next question there. I'm very surprised on the supply side that we don't have stronger relationships with the private sector when it comes to either building new on bases or wings where we're short of supply, or more importantly, when we speak to the relocation issue that you referenced earlier today, that we don't have signed agreements in major urban markets with private sector landlords to assist with a more seamless integration of our members when they move from community to community. And so I've asked questions of other witnesses, and there's not a lot of, we haven't received many recommendations along the lines of public-private partnerships. And so can I ask in terms of your thoughts on forging partnerships with landlords in major urban markets, or conversely with the private sector in order to build more supply in rural and remote areas where it can be a challenge at the best of times?
So I think in terms of supply, we should be looking at all sorts of different innovative practices in gaining that greater supply, and that could be public-private partnerships with various landlords or organizations to be able to build that supply or supply that supply. I think that would be ideal, but I think the main issue is we have to be a bit more innovative in our solutions. We can't just say that because there's some Treasury Board policy that maybe disallows some of those PPPs as an example, that we have to sort of get over that. And because the main thing is, for me, the ultimate objective here is that no member should ever go unhoused and worry about a roof over their head. So let's get over this idea of if a policy is in place that doesn't allow certain things, let's get over it and start moving forward with different solutions. One of them is a greater cooperation with the private sector. Absolutely.
Yeah. And part of that, I think, solving the problem of our housing challenges across the country is working with our municipal partners and our provincial partners. And so you've done the cross-country tour in terms of looking at the condition of housing and the supply issues. And the federal government certainly can't do it alone in terms of solving those challenges that we have. Our government has, instead of demonizing municipal mayors and councillors, we're working with them. We're incentivizing new supply to try to get at some of the issues that you talked about. In your travels, have you talked to municipalities and/or provincial representatives in terms of how we play a key role in working with them, not just the private sector, as I referenced earlier, but other levels of government in order to get at some of these issues for our members?
Yeah, so absolutely.
Collins has
So
about 20
in every basin wing we visit in different communities across the country, we always try to visit with the municipalities, whether that's the mayor or different representatives, to understand what they're doing in terms of making sure that there's a supply, both for the community members as well as military families and members. And there is a lot being done. It depends on the different communities across the country, but there's a lot being done, whether that's reducing the bureaucracy of permitting or just in terms of different partnerships too as well, and promoting those partnerships, whether that's with a hotel organization, hotel corporations, or whether that's with developers. So there is a lot being done out there.
We're going to have to leave it there, even if there is a lot being done. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. It's much appreciated. I'd like to get back to some of the questioning by Mr. Bazan regarding DND's reaction to allegations to the effect that in Nova Scotia there were military staff that were unhoused, that were turning to food banks. I understand that there is an obstacle, there's an issue with how safe it is to really disclose that one is is unhoused, for instance. But the fact that DND is sort of casting that aside is an extra obstacle in the sense that members feel like it's not taken seriously by national defense, this situation they're in.
So I would say that certainly the Canadian Armed Forces is taking it seriously, but do they have all the resources and the different partners to be able to really, it's more than anything, it's to build that supply. Do they get the attention of the Treasury Board in making sure that the different benefit packages and compensation packages do allow for proper compensation and allow people to live? I think the main issue is that they may not be listened to, or may not be able to get their points across in terms of what's needed. And that's my role in many ways, is to get it out into the public eye, what it is that they may not be hearing, and maybe get a better understanding of what we're hearing on the ground. But certainly CAF members, CAF leadership, they do hear it. They do hear it. But as I said, a simple wellness check may not be getting the full understanding. And I think more than anything that certainly when I talk to leadership, particularly on at the leadership level on the base and wing, they are trying to do everything possible to be able to make sure their members and families are well supported. But ultimately, it is a resource issue. I think more than anything, they simply do not have the resources in various areas, whether that's infrastructure on base, whether that's many cases they do have great relations with the community, working on various ways of doing it, various innovative ways of getting greater accommodation and so on. But ultimately, it is a resource issue. They need more resources in order to have the infrastructure necessary to support military members and families. I always look at it, if families are not well supported, as I've said to you many, many times here, if families are not well supported, your families are not well supported, you're always worrying about them, you can't do your job. And that's what I think is fundamental here too as well.
Mais je reviens quand même au fait.
I'd like to get back to the fact that what we saw in the media was that D&D did not really confirm the fact that there were military members who needed food banks, who were didn't have a roof over their head, and they were dismissed. Is that really the right entity to make sure that the military members are well cared for? Should there be another entity asking questions? Are things okay? Do you have a roof over your head? Do you need food support? You said that the ombudsman, because it's a confidential office, that you would receive more of this information. But should wellness checks go through something other than DND, for instance?
I think wellness checks are something we would all do. If we had a family, we would do a wellness check in the sense of our smaller family. It is the right thing to do, but it's just one indicator. You have to remember that groups like the chaplaincy, who are a confidential service like us, the military family resource centers, the social workers there, they have a very, very good understanding of what's happening out in the family, what's happening out in the communities. And I think you can't just simply rely on a wellness check. You have to rely on all your various sources of information, including our organization too as well, which talks to members, which talks to families. They have the opportunity to tell us various things that they may be too embarrassed or afraid to be able to tell their leadership. Probably embarrassed more than anything because it's not a great situation. Obviously, it's a very tragic situation. So I think simply relying on a wellness check is not the right thing to do. Solely, you have to rely on all your sources of information.
Merci beaucoup. Vous avez parlé.
Thank you very much. You referred to the importance of having a global strategy for military housing, and clearly not all military members are in PNQs or in barracks. Many live in the community, as you said. In that context, should we have a further discussion with, say, the Minister of Housing? Because otherwise, could it be that we're working in silo, that you'd have defense and the housing minister working in silos?
That is my point, and it is something they are working on. They are working on that global accommodation strategy. I've always seen, when I asked the various members and various audiences across the country, everybody talks about one silo at a time. What is needed is a strategy that takes all of those various aspects together and is agile too as well, because our economic environment across the country changes, and it is changing now across the country, and the strategy has to take that into account. So CFHD, in and of itself, if it is updated as it says it will every year, that should go some way to making it more agile. PLD was not that at all. And so I talk about a global strategy that allows members to build equity if they want. We all typically most Canadians want to own a home. So your strategy, your compensation package should allow for that. But it's particularly for junior members, they're not generally going to be able to afford a house right off the bat. They should have access to housing on base or easy housing in the community, whatever it might be. So I think it's that total package that's necessary.
Okay. Madame Mass in 6 minutes.
Thank you. I really appreciate you being here. You're providing great context for what's, I think, going on. And of course, we know that with the military, it is a microcosm of ultimately what's happening in the greater Canadian society. I mean, I certainly hear that in terms of people trying to find housing in my own riding. And of course, we all do. But this is far more specific and far more complicated and required of the job. In all of those responses that you think that we need, I mean, you just heard Mr. Bazan's motion to cancel that housing rent increase. Do you think that is a viable answer as part of that solution? What do you think about that? I'm interested to hear.
I certainly think it's a viable solution. Anything that can help members and families in being able to afford housing is a great solution. Now, at the same time, we have to remember that housing on base, if it's available, is another issue. But if it's on base, it is capped at 25% of their gross salary, which is a good thing. But at the same time, if the rents rise, but it's still capped at 25%, where's the money going to come from to actually maintain that infrastructure on base? So I come back to this idea that whatever it is, more resources is required to be able to support the infrastructure on base. I think at this point in time, even though it is a Treasury Board policy, it's governed by the Treasury Board. That policy of rent charges sort of equated to the average local rent in the communities. Yeah. I think it's a bit tone deaf right now in terms of what we're seeing across Canada for all families being able to afford housing. I think it's a bit, we have to understand that, as I say, military families and members are disadvantaged because they have to move more often, and they don't always have that choice. Probably, I would say rarely do they have that choice. Therefore, they have to go into a community, find housing, and it may not be available, and then they get pushed into sometimes not safe housing, sometimes unaffordable housing,
not accessible
housing for families with special needs or disabilities in the family type of thing. So there's a whole range of issues there. But I think, to be honest, I think it's a bit tone deaf right now.
Speaking of that, so your team published in 2022 the service before self, and it was that special investigation. Have you heard? What have you heard since that report in terms of the findings? Has the government put forward any of the recommendations from that report? And maybe could you table it with this committee so that we can include it as a part of this study right now?
Well, certainly we can table it. Type of thing. It's published now.
Yes.
I think one of the main issues related to housing in that particular report was the idea of there is a need to modernize the definition of family. We all know that families are changing since we had our 2.5 children and mother and father type of thing. And so right now we are taking care of more elderly parents. It seems to be that we have more families with special needs children, all sorts of various issues like that. And we have not always a mother and father. The definition has changed. So what we did say in our report is that you need to modernize the definition of family, but maintain some flexibility for decision makers to make a fair decision. Don't try and create that 100% perfect policy that governs every situation ad infinitum. Make sure you give decision makers the ability to make a fair decision based on other circumstances which you may not have foreseen. But absolutely, in there, you need to modernize the definition of family and have policies, initiatives and so on that accommodate that different definition of family nowadays.
One of the things that Mr. Bazan touched on, and it was a bit more vague, and I'm hoping you can give specifics. If you can't, I understand, but it was about when you talked about what members had sent you in terms of the really deplorable, horrific living conditions. Can you be more specific with this committee? Are you allowed?
Oh, certainly we're allowed, because it was sent anonymously, or not so much anonymously, but I was sent pictures of different conditions in various barracks, whether it was in Trenton or in other areas, that were horrid. Toilet facilities not up to standard by any means. Mold on various walls and ceilings and so on. And there is more out there. There was just a few pictures of it out there. I have raised this with the Deputy Minister of National Defence, and I will be having a conversation with the Assistant Deputy Minister of Infrastructure to speak about this particular issue. This was not my experience, as I said, in the 80s. Yes, they're not five-star hotels, but at the same time, I don't expect that any member would live in those types of conditions.
Okay. I really appreciate that because considering, I mean, even just mold and what that has in terms of its impacts on anybody, but kids especially, just trying to live in a safe environment is very, very key. I wanted to quickly ask, I have very limited time left, about you talked about spouses working on base and their ability to do so. Can you talk about the CFMWS being on strike and what that's done to families currently?
Well, I can't
Very
speak,
briefly, please.
Yeah, I can't speak specifically on that latter part of your question. The issue for us is primarily around as families move around the country and are posted, it does lead to spouses or partners not being able to find appropriate employment. And we all know nowadays you kind of need two incomes to be able to live appropriately nowadays. And so as spouses and partners move across with their military members, they may not be able to find any job, or have to go to the great organization Tim Hortons, work there, or they may not find employment. We call it underemployment. The idea that perhaps as a medical professional, they don't have the qualifications according to another province and territory, and so they are underemployed.
We're now on to the 5-minute round. Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, through you to our witness, I've had calls from soldiers that they're trying to leave, or they've had to leave the military because the rent or mortgage payments were outpacing their pay increases. What's been your experience in talking to soldiers who've had to leave?
Well, certainly, as I said, the largest reason why members are leaving nowadays, and that's according to the CAF survey itself, is military family issues, of which part of that is the cost of living, cost of housing, being able to access childcare, being able to access a doctor, all those various reasons. But over the last year and a half, as mortgage rates have gone up in particular and cost of living has gone up, certainly that has become a bigger part of members leaving nowadays. And that's what we're hearing too as well.
So I have reports of life-infested mattresses in barracks, and you mentioned the black mold. How long does it usually take to get that fixed as opposed to just painting it over, which has been the practice?
Well, I can't say that. I can't say how long it takes to actually fix it. What I will say is that in order to do all the maintenance that is required on the base, likely more resourcing is needed to be able to do that.
Have you noticed a difference between contractors who were locally sourced versus big companies that were sourced even from out of province to come and do the upgrades?
No, I wouldn't say that so much. I think one of the questions I always ask the Canadian Forces Housing Agency is because they hire contractors to be able to get the work done in the residential housing units. And certainly in different bases and wings, they've had problems in gaining the contractors, certainly during different times of the year. But I think at this point in time, it's starting to get better. But it all depends on the economic environment at the time, whether they're able to attract contractors or not. Cold Lake is the perfect example. When the oil patch is up, they all go to the oil patch to do the maintenance there. When the oil patch is down, they'll come back to help on the base.
Okay, of the 8,500 units disposed of from 1996 to 2013, what number have been replaced, or what number has been surpassed in terms of the 8,500 units?
I certainly couldn't answer that question in that level of detail. That's a good question for the Canadian Forces Housing Agency.
Okay, so what amount has been set aside that you're aware of, if any, for infrastructure costs related to the required electrical capacity upgrades needed to replace the present furnaces with heat pumps? I understand most living quarters have 100 amps, and the heat pumps require around 200 amps.
Well, certainly it was actually a question that they showed us, or actually an initiative they showed us in Greenwood. They were replacing some of the heating systems with heat pumps. But again, it is an issue of electrical capacity. I mean, I'm an engineer by trade, so I understand it. But certainly, it will depend on the individual age of the electrical capacity in each of the houses. But that, again, it's a good question, again, for the housing agency. They will have the details of that particular issue.
Okay, and with respect to the new electric vehicles that are being mandated, our fire chief told us the vehicle should be a certain distance from the actual structure to safeguard against the fires that just happen spontaneously from time to time. Have any provisions, to the best of your knowledge, been made to make room for what is coming ahead in terms of new vehicle requirements?
I'm not aware of the details of that, other than what we saw in Greenwood, where there were some charging stations being implemented and installed, type of thing. But I'm not aware of the details of the distances between them. No.
Who's responsible for issuing the building permits? And do you know whether or not how the barracks and PMQs have inspections at all?
Well, certainly, building permits for residential housing would be done by the community. But certainly on base, that's another good question for the Assistant Deputy Minister, IE.
And do you know how long, on average, it takes for the situations of the mold or lice for it to be ameliorated? Have the soldiers told you directly that it's taken too long?
Well, certainly, I don't know how long it takes, per se, but they have told me it's taking too long.
Mr. Fillmore, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And Mr. Lick and Ms. Hines, thank you very much for joining us today. Much appreciated. Mr. Lick, is it true that the CAF limits rent for members living on base to 25% of their income?
Yes, it's 25% of their gross family income.
Okay. So that means that on-base rent increases would not result in rents that are higher than 25% of member income.
Yeah, they do have a personal responsibility to demonstrate that income, and there's a process that goes along with it. But they do have the ability to cap their rent at 25% of their gross family income.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Is it true that it's the Treasury Board that recommends rent increases on base in accordance with the CPI as a matter of policy, and not the Minister of National Defence?
Well, it's my understanding, and Robin will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that it is a Treasury Board policy for residential housing on base, in this case, government housing, and it is basically approved by the Minister of National Defence.
Okay, thank you. So going off base then, isn't it true that for members and their families that choose to live off base, salary increases that keep pace with inflation would be an important thing for rent affordability?
Yeah, absolutely. And the CFHD does mitigate some of that particular issue for members. Now, we are talking about more junior members than senior members in that regard.
Okay. Thank you. I'll make a comment, then I'll continue on. So, I'm going to assume that you would agree that when members of Parliament, and especially members of this committee, have an opportunity to pass budget votes that would increase CAF member salaries, they should do so. You don't have to respond to that. I would say, though, to my colleagues, it's alarming and puzzling then that our Conservative colleagues were whipped to vote against a CAF member salary increase in December 2023. Okay, moving off of that. Mr. Lick, I think it was your testimony earlier this session that you do not know of any CAF members living in tents. Is that correct?
Well, certainly I don't personally, and I don't think we would not, and Robin can correct me or confirm that I don't think we've received any complaints in that regard. So it's hard for me to say whether they do or do not, just because I haven't heard it. But I come back to my point earlier that there are other groups that do support members separate from myself and my organization, whether that's the chaplaincy, whether that's the Military Family Resource Center, whether that's different charitable organizations such as Together We Stand. They will have another part to that story that I think is important to hear.
Thanks for that. I just wanted to make sure the record's clear here. When Mr. Bazan invited you to agree with him that the Minister of National Defence misled Parliament on the point of no CAF members living in tents, you agreed with him that Parliament was misled. I just want to offer you a chance to clarify that if you'd like to.
Well, what I am hearing is that there are some members who, at different points in time, have been or are homeless. That is what I'm hearing. What they are living in, I don't believe they've actually told me, but they are living in RVs, they are couch surfing. In some cases, the one dependent told me that they were homeless for 5 months. Now, they were living somewhere, obviously, but not in a proper home.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you very much for that. Shifting gears, the committee has heard some testimony from one military spouse at the committee here, so I think it's okay to say her name. Her name was Alyssa Truong, regarding the challenges that spouses face during periods of relocation. She in particular raised concerns around spousal employment. It's come up a little bit today already. And that spousal employment can be made more difficult because of delays in the processing of or the transferring of relevant documentation like driver's licenses and healthcare cards and professional credentials and that kind of thing. I'm just wondering if you can share any solutions that you might have unearthed in your work that there might be to this issue, and how we can better support the spousal side of the equation when they're required to move across country.
Well, I'll give you two examples. I think one is that on the medical qualification side, I think those medical qualifications are governed or licensed, however it works, by the different medical associations provincially and territorially. And so there needs to be more work done to understand and provide equivalencies, to provide a better, even for all Canadians, this isn't just for military members or families, but if there was a better system of understanding those qualifications and providing equivalencies so that they were more easily transferable, that would be a good thing for all of Canada, not just military members. And at the same time, I think one of the things that we have noted is that there is the Military Spouse Employment Initiative within D&D. It is a tool that they use to market, but it is primarily marketed within D&D. And I think I've talked with
Again, I'm sorry to keep interrupting at the end, but we seem to be rolling past.
Can I just finish this one point, because it is important?
I'm sure it is, yes.
Yeah, so in this case, they need to do better marketing of this to both outside federal departments, other federal departments, as well as provincial departments.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Madame Normandine. 2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. On a technical point, if you don't have the answer today, no problem. 2.5 or 3 months ago in November, I asked the Brigadier General to provide market studies that had been done for the setting of certain fees. The amount that is granted to military members has reduced. In St. John, $400 less, for instance, to have access to an apartment. In Bagotville, same thing. And yet, we know there's a lack of housing in these areas. Is that something that's been drawn to your attention? And would you say that we rightly have the impression that defense is disconnected from the reality of the housing market around military bases?
So in terms of what is likely Brigadier General Tattersall probably brought that forward in terms of the fees. So I'm not exactly sure which fee she was talking about. Well, we'll assume it's the CFHD. So in that regard, CFHD was set up to accommodate or mitigate some of the issues with housing and the cost of housing in the community. At the same time, they recognize in the end that they needed to have a transition of that particular program, we'll call it, or that particular benefit, and that's why this there is a phased-in approach to that. So that may have been what she was talking about in that regard. The fees did change, but there is a transition there. But the other part of it is that I don't think they're disconnected. But I come back to this idea that, because certainly when I talk to the leadership on bases and wings, they are not disconnected. They understand what's going on there. But what to understand what is happening across the entire country, I think that is probably the bigger issue. But as I said, you have to listen to all the various sources of information and not just that formal wellness check.
Merci. C'était pas exactement sur.
It wasn't exactly on CFHD. It was on another point, but I realize I won't have time for another question. Sorry.
Good decision, Madame Normandy. Madame Matheson, 2.5 minutes, please.
Just to go back in terms of that expansion of housing stock around or near bases and having all options on the table, there is, of course, that the development or the ability to develop underdeveloped lands that are owned by the federal government itself. Certainly, municipalities have raised this concern that we could transfer some of those lands specifically to not-for-profit housing organizations that could develop them, cooperatives, like all kinds of lower and more affordable housing options. Could you elaborate on the initiatives that you've seen, if any, or discussions that you've had with ministry officials about that specific going forward in terms of affordable housing?
Well, certainly when visiting Greenwood as one of the last examples, I talked there with the municipality, so representatives of the municipality, and they were looking for how to get in contact with the department to discuss transfer, whether it's a transfer of land, but using unused land to build affordable housing, to have more housing available for military families and so on. So I did put them in contact because I knew some of the people in the department. I put them in contact with them. I don't know the outcome of those discussions at all, but I did put them in contact with them.
So you haven't heard, I mean, on the one side, municipalities or those associated are very excited, but you haven't heard on the other side whether there's been a response or any kind of acceptance and move on that.
I think because it's relatively recent, I haven't heard the outcome of those particular discussions. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. It may not be the same in every base and wing across the country, but some have greater ability to do that than others.
Would you recommend to the Department of National Defense that they take advantage of these conversations?
I think it's a recommendation to the government writ large that we have a lot of unused land that can probably help out in different ways with different solutions, different partnerships, whatever it might be. I would say that there's a lot of opportunity to look at and to implement various innovative solutions. Let's just keep looking at them.
Perfect.
And Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Minister of Defense is apparently clinging to the wellness check system as proof that the Halifax Emergency Management Coordinator and the Canadian Legion were not being truthful in reporting the homelessness of Canadian Armed Forces members in Halifax. Do you believe that the Halifax Emergency Management Coordinator and the Canadian Legion, that there are indeed homeless CAF members?
Well, as I said, I don't rely on one source of information either. I listen to that particular testimony, and what I hear from members and families is the same thing.
Okay.
So that's pretty clear to me.
Right. So we that not only is that testimony credible, it's supported by other sources of information that you have from the numerous discussions you have with CAF members.
That's correct.
Yeah. In fact, you said everybody knows somebody within the CAF that is suffering from either struggling with homelessness or access to
And
food.
it may not be today. It may have been yesterday.
Right.
It may be tomorrow, one paycheck away.
Indeed. In response to my order paper question, actually it was Madame Lalonde confirmed that for the last several years, more members are leaving the forces than joining the forces. There is a crisis of recruitment and retention that's resulted in 16,000 vacancies and 10,000 undertrained personnel. Where does housing fit into this and access to housing?
As I stated earlier, military family issues is the largest reason why people are leaving. And I believe that it's over the last year and a half, as I'm hearing from various members and families on bases, that the cost of housing, the cost of living is becoming more important. It still remains that access to a doctor, access to childcare, access to spousal and partner employment remain issues. But the cost of living, cost of housing is becoming more important, as it is for all Canadians too as well. We must remember that it's not simply military families.
Indeed, but they're choosing to leave the military for these reasons.
That's correct.
Yeah. Mr. Fillmore seemed to go to some length to suggest that or point out the difference in responsibility between the Minister of Defense and Treasury Board Secretariat, resulting in increasing the rent for in some cases, what you've described, I think 3 times as horrid base housing. Have you met any CAF member that cares which Liberal minister is raising their rent?
I'm not sure how I would answer that per se, but I will come back to the point. I think right now, given the economic environment that's out there, given the issues of military members leaving because of cost of living, cost of housing, family issues, I think raising the rent at this point, it's my personal opinion, that this is not the right thing to do at this point in time.
Right. So not the right thing. And I would say Treasury Board versus the Minister of Defense is a distinction without a difference to a CAF member having their rent raised.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Do I have any time left?
A minute and 30 seconds.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. Perhaps we can come back again do you have some more examples? You 3 times said absolutely horrid in describing conditions of some housing. Could you give us some examples of what would render a living unit horrid?
Well, and certainly when I talk about the living units, the pictures that I've been shown from military members, these are the barracks or shacks, and certainly not the residential housing units that I've seen. Those are different. They're 2 different things. But certainly there were these pictures were horrid of, toilets not working, toilets overflowing, mold on walls and ceilings, heating not working, all sorts of issues that you would not expect in a facility that houses the people that save our lives and defend our security. And so I think it's for me it was shocking. Given my experience, my experience is still 30 years old, but that's no excuse.
20 seconds.
What about the residential housing units then? Are they much better, or they're?
I would say overall, and this is a good question for the CFHA as well, but I would say overall that they're not in bad condition. They're better than what I remember, to be honest. The residential housing units, we generally see the newer ones as they're getting updated.
They're building 20 a year, though, I understand.
Yeah, they're not building, and as I said, I think there's more needed.
Backlog of 8,000?
There's more needed.
We're going to have to leave it there again. Thank you. Final question, Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ehrlich and Ms. Hines, for being with us to answer some of our questions today. I guess the first question I'll ask is, if somebody is in an extremely desperate situation, you mentioned that family members of a military member said that they had been homeless for 5 months. If there are situations like this and someone does reach out, is there a way, a temporary fix, a temporary solution for these people who are in a really desperate situation and who, for example, in Halifax right now are experiencing a bad storm? Is there a situation where they can be helped temporarily by someone from the department or from the military?
I mean, there are all sorts of ways that this could be mitigated. The particular issue of not having a home, not having a place to sleep, as I talked about, couch surfing and RVs and various things. But there's also for the more, I would say, we'll just say it, the more tragic situations of domestic violence and things like that, which tragically does occur. That many bases and wings do have that 1 or 2 different residential housing units where they can accommodate the family short term until they're able to resolve that issue. I would say that I'm very proud of CAF leadership on bases and wings. Or if anybody came forward with an issue like that, they would take care of them. They would find a solution. I think I'm very proud of the CAF leadership in that way. But again, it all comes down to a resource issue. How do they get the resources sometimes to deal with everybody? There is also a personal responsibility in this too as well. That we all know of people that may not have the financial literacy to be able to properly manage a budget, a household, and so on. And there are issues like that too as well.
Yep. Thank you very much for that response. In a report in October 2022, it had mentioned that there were 12,000 military housing units, I guess, on bases across the country, and that there are quite a few that are still needed and wait lists in different cities across the country at different bases. I'm wondering if you are aware of whether or not the department takes into account where there's a bigger need, where there's a longer wait list. Are there housing units being built more rapidly in these areas where they may have, a greater need? What does that situation look like?
Well, I don't have the statistics for the construction of housing right now in front of me, obviously, but I think overall more is needed. There's no doubt about that. The wait lists are always rising pretty well across the country now. That's factual. So more is needed. But again, it's a good question for CFHA in terms of the numbers exactly. And I think the issue, of course, is that as costs rise, they're capped at 25%. So where does the other resources for maintenance come from? It has to come from the government in that regard. And so again, it comes back to more resources are necessary. If they're going to cap it at that level, somebody has to pay the difference. And in this case, the government has to pay the difference in that regard.
Last but not least, there were rumors that I've heard about specific people that were in tents or couch surfing, specifically in Halifax. And the thing that I had heard was that they were allowed to be on base during their training, like a 1-month training or however long that might have lasted. And then immediately after, they were told you need to find your own home. And obviously, if you're in a completely new place, it's very difficult to do that. Is there any leniency there? Is there anything you've heard in this regard about a situation like this? And do you know if anybody is working on a solution?
Well, there's certainly some leniency in terms of where they can find housing, how they find housing, and so on. But in the end result, that there's a limited capacity on base to house people. Generally, it's full. So there's no really other opportunity other than in the community to find housing. And again, they get into the situation of there's simply not as much housing as needed, not only for all Canadians, but also for military families in the communities that they serve. And so, it comes down, we need more.
Madam Lambropoulos, that brings our time to a close, and I want to thank you for Mr. Lick and Ms. Hines for your contribution to this study. You're always a welcome welcome witness to this committee. And apparently you'll be a welcome witness next week as well on yet another study. So with that, I'm going to suspend while we go in camera to review a number of things for the committee. So.
you.